if there's one advice, then I should give
Yeah.
that don't really worry about what is the right thing to do, what the society wants to do. Just do
Good.
what you really want to do. If you can't figure out, it's okay. People can't figure out. Just
Right.
do, just do something, and then you'll figure out later.
Right.
There's no reason to put yourself under so much stress and pressure, worrying about whether I made the right decision or will I make money, and that package and all that. It's I think it's really unwarranted. It sort of detracts from the pleasures of life. You can make this experience much more enriching if you can sort of go into this path of discover what you really want to do and then do it.
But probably that wisdom comes from age, and by realizing that
I know it
probably
is
I missed
unfair
those
for
years.
a 15-year-old to decide that, and it's unfair for the society to put pressure on that person when they're doing that. All I'm saying is that leave that pressure. You are going to make mistakes. It's going to be meandering, but you will at least have fun, is what I'm saying.
Hello everyone, my name is Mukul and this is the Deep Neural Notebooks podcast. This is the 5th episode of the podcast, and if I had to choose a favorite episode, I think it would be this one. In this episode, I interview Leslee Lazar. Leslee sir is a cognitive neuroscientist and a visual artist. So this episode is going to be on the intersection of neuroscience and art. And he's a professor at IIT Gandhinagar at the Center for Cognitive and Brain Science, working on the perception of touch and tactile input in the somatosensory cortex of the brain. He is passionate about art and design and uses illustrations, graphic design, photography, collages, and infographics to convey complex stories. Neuroscientist by day and visual artist by evening, his research interests include understanding creativity and the perception of art from a neuroscience point of view. I've been taking interest in neuroscience lately, so I was quite excited for this episode. I attended a few lectures of Leslee sir's Fundamentals of Neuroscience course at IIT Gandhinagar when I was an intern back there, and it was one of the most interactive and enriching lectures that I've ever attended. In this episode, we talk about his journey from zoology to neuroscience, his work in touch perception, about creativity, and about how we as humans share an innate appreciation for art and beauty. On the intersection of computer science and neuroscience, I asked him about his thoughts on brain-computer interfaces like the ones being developed at Neuralink, and about the possibility of being able to model a digital brain. In the end, Leslee sir shares some advice for people who are starting out with neuroscience and a list of books that people can refer to get started. This video was recorded before the COVID-19 lockdown in India, and so we're safe there. And if you enjoyed the conversation or learned something valuable from it, please give a thumbs up or a 5-star rating depending on the streaming platform. It really helps the channel and allows more people to get access to such content. I hope you liked the conversation, and thank you for watching. Alright, thank you sir for doing this.
No problem.
So you did your bachelor's and master's in zoology in Chennai.
Yeah.
So were you always interested in biology or like science for that matter?
Not really. In our society, if you say you want to do history or you want to do English literature, that too back in the early 90s or whatever, there was a huge amount of apprehension and tension and anxiety with the parents as to their son will never get a job or something like that.
Yeah.
It's not wholly untrue. Okay. So the other choices were not even presented to me, which is I think the case even now. So they were like, okay, you have to go to college. So because you're in Chennai, you're Catholic, so you go to Loyola and you choose what you want to choose. So they wanted me to do chemistry. I don't know why, because I think my marks were better in chemistry than
Not
biology.
engineering?
Well, yeah, my dad's an engineer, and they really wanted me to do engineering, but I was never ever interested in engineering at all.
Right.
And so zoology seemed like a good, something that was interesting and slightly exciting to me. So I chose zoology.
And how was that experience? Did you think that you made the right decision that way?
So here's the thing. I mean, I didn't know how my career would pan out, and it has always been a little unpredictable in terms of my career as to which way it goes. So I kind of started enjoying it really early because of one professor I met, who's P. Ravichandran, who's now a full professor at MS University in Trichy. So he had just finished his PhD and he was starting a lab of his own, and which was kind of unheard of, to do research or even to show some enthusiasm to your job. So that sort of really engaged at least 4 or 5 of us in our class to be interested in research and figuring out that it was a lifestyle more than anything else. And so after that, I started enjoying it. I was reading a lot more, so I kind of was interested in biology and behavior right from the beginning. So I would read a lot on genetics, although I understood a very small percentage of what I read.
Right.
So always been interested in questions of behavior and genetics and things like that.
Do you remember your first project in zoology, like some dissection or like something like that?
So we used to have really elaborate dissection classes. So 2 times a week we used to have 3 hours of dissection. So we were one of the last few batches who actually know the insides of a lot of animals. I have dissected 1 semester full of cockroach. The second semester was frog. Then we transitioned into small sharks. Then a garden snail. What else? Many other things. So I actually enjoyed it, and it gives you a lot of. I mean, I didn't enjoy
Right.
killing animals. That's not how I want to sound, but I enjoyed learning that these systems are very complicated, and it's not what the pictures in the textbook and the way you describe. Like everybody can recognize what the DNA looks like. You can draw it; it's there in the picture, but it doesn't look like that. Nobody knows. I mean, a few people have some idea of how it looks like, but it all comes, it comes through a lot of reconstruction. And for you to understand that, I think people need, if you're a serious biologist, you really have to cut open and see what's inside. And so we enjoyed a lot of dissection. And in terms of research, one of the first research projects that I remember that I really enjoyed doing was with Dr. P. Ravichandran. He was a botanist and he sort of studied grasses and medicinal plants and a lot of those things. So he started this tissue culture lab.
Okay.
So you can sort of grow plants in an artificial medium, and you can make a callus, meaning an undifferentiated mass of cells just from different plant parts, and you can combine different I really didn't understand a lot of the
Right.
nuances of it,
Right.
as you can see
But
from my
creating plants in an
description.
artificial environment.
Yeah, so you'd have test tubes where you can grow these plants.
Okay.
And then of course he did a lot more sophisticated analysis, and we were just second year zoology students, not even botany students. So we would just enjoy the sort of ritual of being in a lab. You have to keep it aseptic, so we would sterilize the equipment, we would plate it, and we also grew a lot of bacterial colonies. We were doing some simple assays to figure out if these plant extracts can have some kind of antibacterial properties and things like that. And our college also had an entomology research institute. So they were interested in insects that would cause diseases to plants, which are agriculturally important, medicinal plants and things like that, or also pathogens of these insects which could later mutate and become human viruses. So we would go to that institute, but I didn't do a project there, but it was sort of the first research environment that I was in.
So practically applying what you were learning about. I mean, not even what you were learning about, just practically applying something. Right?
So this was completely different from my degree. So this was, everything was extracurricular.
Okay.
It had nothing to do, the dissection was part of my classes,
Right.
but all the research used to happen after 4 o'clock after the class. So it had nothing to do with my grades, nothing to do with my sort of learning. In fact, like I said, he was the only guy doing this, so it couldn't have been part of the system.
Right.
So so that's
But then,
how it was.
so you did your PhD in neuroscience. So
Yeah.
when were those? I mean, when did you start finding animal behavior interesting? And I mean, when did those roots start off?
So in zoology, especially at that time in Loyola College, the smartest kids would become ecologists. They would be studying, animal behavior, and I was also volunteering at the turtle conservation organization locally, where we would walk on the beach and collect the turtle eggs and rebury them at a hatchery and try and send out these plants. So
In Chennai, right?
in Chennai, yeah. So ecology, animal behavior was, always the cool thing to do, but somehow I got interested into the lab-based science, and at that time, neuroscience was getting popular.
Hmm.
There is this huge glut of information that you get from neuroscience now. It all started, back in the mid and the late
Hmm.
90s. And so I was at the right time. I sort of followed the trend, and it
Hmm.
also matched with my um, interest and passion in understanding behavior, and how you have complex
Hmm.
behaviors that are sort of result of how your nervous system is, right?
Hmm.
And so it was only a natural transition to go from studying behavior to neuroscience. And of course, there were a lot more labs working on that particular area at that
Hmm.
time. And yeah, so for me, it was quite
How was the
natural.
transition that way in terms of the subjects that changed?
So it wasn't such a drastic transition,
Okay.
because
Like, do all
neuros.
neuroscientists come from sort of a zoological background or like some sort of a biological background, or should they?
Well, there are two questions there. So neuroscience is really an umbrella discipline, and right now
Hmm.
you have computer scientists, you have linguists,
Hmm.
you have philosophers, you have
Hmm.
molecular biologists, so you really have, and computer scientists, and people from different disciplines getting into neuroscience
Hmm.
and answering different parts of the question.
Hmm.
But traditionally, if you look at it, the first neuroscience department was sort of like a slight transition, or even just a name change from a physiology department. So people were always interested in the brain and the nervous
Hmm.
system, but it was
Hmm.
always under physiology, which if you think about it, in the back in the 60s or even before that,
Hmm.
that was sort of the most important thing people were doing. Physiology,
Hmm.
and then microbiology and things,
Right. Right.
where um, so there is always this trend to rename these disciplines.
Right.
Like, even when we were studying in college, we were zoology, and everybody's like, "Oh, zoology is such an old-fashioned name. We're not going to attract students." So all they
Right.
did was they repainted the building and called it life sciences. So, but the syllabus was the same. So, in some ways, neuroscience, if you think about it, people have been asking these questions and
Hmm.
trying to understand, but they've been in physiology department,
Hmm.
and now it's called neuroscience. Even neuroscience now, people say it's not as sexy as calling it brain. I know, my PhD was in National Brain Research Center, and
Hmm.
I remember having a conversation with one of the founders, and when they were wondering about the name, they really wanted it to be a neuroscience institute,
Hmm.
because they
Sounds cool.
not only wanted to study the brain, but
Hmm.
other things, but
Right.
they were like, no, 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 we should
Correct.
call it the
Neuroscience.
Brain Research Center.
Right. Right. So, sir, what was your PhD thesis about?
Okay, so my PhD thesis was on touch perception. So we have a representation of skin on different parts of your body in the brain. So different parts of the brain, does different jobs,
Hmm.
and there is an area called the somatosensory area, which is involved in processing information about touch.
Okay.
Okay, and if you think about touch, your hands are one of the most frequently used parts of the
Hmm.
body to interface with the world
Hmm.
using touch. So
Right.
the surface of the skin there is very special,
Right.
and so we want to understand how we get this whole percept of touching different textures, wetness, smoothness, hardness, softness,
Hmm.
and all these are because of different patterns of firing in the neurons in the different areas in the brain.
Okay.
Okay, so I focused on this area called area 3B, which is a very central area for processing touch,
Okay.
and I was interested in seeing how these fingers were represented. The skin
Hmm.
of the fingers, how was represented there in a map,
Right.
and what were the dynamics of the neurons firing for different kind of stimulation that was given to the hand. So I also got involved in similar projects in the lab, where we were asking the question about plasticity, and what happens if these inputs that are coming in from the hand is being cut, right?
Hmm.
That happens in accidents. So if you cut the nerves that are giving you input to the brain from the hand,
Hmm.
what happens to that piece of
Right.
real estate in the brain.
Right.
Is it going to become vacant or something going to take over, and what is the mechanics of it? So that's sort of the broad area that we were looking at.
Right. I also read that the implications of your thesis was that people who suffered accidents in the spinal cord, they could sort of recover like movements, things like that.
Not directly from my PhD thesis. It is one of the topics that the field tries to answer, is to, um, uh, how to sort of lessen the suffering of people who have got this kind of injury, and what kind of training program can help them change the brain network so that they can regain these hand movements that they have lost. But my thesis was more of a basic study in trying to understand the pattern of these neurons firing, so that, maybe it will lead to something, but it was not directly addressing that question.
So then you went on to do your postdoc at the Harvard Medical School. So what was the topic there? Was it an extension of what you were working on during your PhD?
No, actually, it was the polar opposite if you think about it in neuroscience terms, because I was working on sensory systems, and I had spent a lot of years trying to understand or thinking about how does perception happen, and it's a little different from the way the motor systems work. That is, that the parts of the brain that are giving you an output. Okay, so in many ways, it was a practical sort of decision, or I thought I was making a practical decision. Say, if I work on the motor systems, we could measure it much more easily than if you want to measure perceptual systems. Because if you're working with animals, you really don't know what they're perceiving. You'll have to come up with a task and train the animals to indicate that they have perceived something, and that's a little tricky, right? It's I mean, it is obviously a philosophical landmine, but it's also a, in terms of practical neuroscience, um, um, experimental paradigms, also it's very time consuming and it's difficult. So I then chose a lab which was working on motor areas, meaning the areas in the part of the brain that are responsible for movement, you know the rhythmic movement of the legs while walking, and also the signals that tell you when to start moving. So one of the reason why I joined the lab was that they were using these new techniques called optogenetics, which is a very powerful technique which can manipulate different groups of neurons very specifically. So before that, the technology has been stagnant for a long time, where you would just stick an electrode into the brain and you would not know which neurons you are activating. So there are different kinds of neurons, different kind of cells. It doesn't matter. You just say that spatially you're going to stimulate, say, 20 microns or 1 millimeter around it or something like that. We never ever thought about what is the different kind of neurons you can stimulate, and this was the big paradigm shift in terms of neuroscience, that you are able to manipulate different kinds of neurons. So I was very excited about the technique, and I thought, um, with the motor system, you could have very fine sort of measurement of change in behavior as you manipulate different kinds of neurons. So you can correlate the two and say that these neurons are giving rise to this kind of responses.
You wrote an article about how using transgenic mice, they were sort of injected with some gene probably that could allow them to see in the infrared spectrum.
Okay. So I didn't write that article, as in I didn't do the research. So I also used to write, for popular press.
But
So
that's
some,
not an experiment that you did.
no,
That's something
yeah,
that
it was something that the people in the news outlet wanted to write about, and so I wrote for them. Yeah.
That makes me think how, why do we feel, I mean, can we extrapolate what we learn from rodents like mice and other smaller animals and sort of extrapolate that to understand something about the human brain? Does that, well, I mean, obviously it's something that is being practiced all over the world, but how can we sort of relate the two?
Okay. So in terms of extending the studies um from rodents to humans, or even primates to humans, right? Essentially, we are all made of the same matter. Okay, and even if you look at the organization of the brain, there's some kind of a rough blueprint for the brain that at least all mammalian systems follow. Brains get complicated as animals are higher up on the evolutionary tree. Okay, so if you look at a closer relative like the great apes, the brain organization and things are very similar, and so are the cognitive capacities. We have made a huge leap, but the closest would be the great apes, and then you have the primates, right, the non-human primates. So it depends on how, it's sort of a sequential organization from the more complex to the simple. Of course it's not a linear thing, because it there are multiple branches and multiple systems have evolved independently again and again, like the eye for example has multiply evolved many times. And so you have sophisticated eyes in squids and eagles, and we have far less acuity than those animals. Okay, so going back to the question of you know studying neuronal systems in mammalian stuff, it's the best alternative that we have, right? But it's not something very blind. The neurons, they are almost the same. But I also want to add that um, you know everything that works on rodents will not work on humans. Like for example, now we are having the coronavirus problem, right? So say even Ebola can be cured, I think 80% in the rats. You can give them some antiviral drug, and I think it's a problem of that drug. When you give it to humans, it does not work as well as it works in humans. Okay, so you do have to take these studies with a pinch of salt. Okay, they not only study it in smaller mammals like rats or non-human primates. People also study dissociated neurons on the cell plates. you know so you have to sort of combine all these evidence with knowing what are the limitations of the study. If you really only want to study a particular channel on the surface of the neuron, okay, then it doesn't matter. All you need are the few cells. So you would look at it in a petri plate under the microscope, right? If you want to study, say, altruistic behavior, right, maybe you can come up with some kind of a paradigm in rats. Maybe even if you want to study autism or depression, people do that in rats. I myself don't know how effective it is, whether you have a proper behavioral readout for it. So the advantage of working with the animal systems is that you can manipulate stuff, right? You can go and knock off some neurons, you can go and record from neurons. And if you come to the cell systems, that it's even better, right? You are looking at particular receptors or particular channels or a particular small protein inside the cell. So there are advantages and disadvantages to different systems. Okay.
It mostly works probably in many cases, so that's why probably.
Well, I don't know what you mean by it works.
As in, let's say I actually read about intermittent fasting. So
Okay.
I read somewhere that it has not been, I mean, the effects, the advantages that are there on the internet, they have been experimented on mice, basically. So mice was kept, was starved for like 8 hours or so, like for some weeks or months. And it was noticed that he had more sort of energy to do some tasks. So
yeah, so you cannot, I would be very wary of taking a rat study for intermittent fasting. Our metabolic rates are different, our diets are different, our digestive systems are different, and I mean, I could even say the size is different, so the scale of your digestive system is going to be different.
but a
But
lot of complexities that we need to.
definitely, yeah.
So you also work at the intersection of art and science.
Okay, so these are separate things. Okay, so I used to do some graphic design work, mostly because I was interested in science communication. I think science is obviously very very important for society to understand how viruses spread. And there was actually a paper just yesterday published showing that the Wuhan virus is not a man-made virus. It's a natural virus, and it's not coming from a lab, but people still stick to their old stories of China made this virus, is a Chinese virus. So so issues like this actually do stand on the people's ability to understand science, and also the scientists' ability to communicate what this science is, right? So and science is changing their mind all the time, and that is the process. And the central tenet of science is that it will keep refining itself, and somehow there has to be this channel of communication between society and scientists kept open, entertained. And also it's a big challenge in the current times because pretty much all communication medium and paradigms are getting sort of shuffled. We have TikTok, we have WhatsApp. You laugh now, but TikTok is going to bring you the next
Right.
political change or whatever.
Mm.
So that's what my interest in. So I have not been doing a lot on that lately, mostly because I'm occupied in doing research in the tactile perception,
Mm.
which was sort of an extension from my PhD work.
Mm.
And so I am interested in touch perception, but not coming at it from a cellular point of view, from a bottom up approach that our perception um, is sort of one way, that we are actually just detecting signals from the outside. So
Okay.
if I touch something rough, it's just purely that it's
Hmm.
the signals from outside that is giving me the reality of perception.
Hmm.
But the point is that who you are, and the training, the context, there is, we
Hmm.
call that a top down approach. So even the language that you use actually changes a lot in terms of what you perceive. So I am interested in that, in terms of texture perception and shape perception, and how um, different senses merge together in terms of multisensory perception. So I'm looking at touch and vision, and touch and sound, how they are combined to give us this whole concept of the construct of perception. So that's the research interest. I also have research interest in creativity. So what are the creative processes, which is also from a very neuroscience point of view. So which part of the brain is required for certain kinds of creativity? How do you even break down a creative process? Is there a way you can say that, okay, the creative process starts with this, you make a blueprint, then you finalize the thing, and then you come up? Or is it just like an insight, you immediately get this flash? So it's sort of uh, you can give examples for both. You can have like a sudden insight, or you look at artists, it doesn't come to them at one stretch. They work on it for 10-15 years to fine tune their technique. So what really is the process? And I'm not claiming that neuroscience is the way to study it. It's probably a very small component of how the entire creative process is, because it's very much rooted in society and history and the techniques and the
Right.
technology. um,
Also depends on what we find creative and what other people do not. So.
well, so let's assume you have a wide spectrum of some things that everybody finds it as creative. We can come to a consensus that, oh, look, this is really creative.
Okay.
So we can study that,
Right.
as opposed to something that some people find creative and something not. So you can sidestep that problem. But once you have a truly creative process, now how do you sort of conceptualize it in terms of neuroscience and cognitive science? So why and what are the mental processes that happen for that particular person to be creative and come up with that outcome?
Right. So can we localize this behavior to one portion of the brain? That.
So there have been a lot of studies. There's a lot of interest in neuroscience and studying creativity. So people have looked at different networks. So nowadays people don't just talk about one area, but will realize that there are networks of the brain which has these activity that is circulated through them. So it's like, okay, this network is involved for this kind of creative processes. So
Okay.
people have some idea about where it's localized, but it still doesn't apply. It still doesn't sort of clarify what are the strategies people use and how
Right.
is that enabled by this network. So we are very nascent. The field is very nascent right now.
Right. But can I read somewhere that probably we can attribute all of this to the prefrontal cortex? Can it, in some sense, supervise this or like nurture it? Or something?
Yeah, so the textbook definition is that the prefrontal cortex works as a central executive, so it's sort of the boss of many other areas that it can sort of control, whether it can put the brakes or you want to activate it. So there is a heavy involvement of the frontal cortices for, especially the right frontal cortex, for creativity. but that does not mean that the parietal cortexes, which are a little behind the frontal cortex, is not involved. So um, yeah, so multiple areas are involved, and it doesn't make sense right now
Right.
in this podcast to reel out the different areas
Right.
that are involved.
Right. Cool. So, and so since you work on graphic design and creating art, as people can see probably in the background.
Mhm.
Uh, so, what is like in your research? Has there been an insight that allows you to think about what people consider as beautiful, and other than the carnal aspects of it, why were there any evolutionary factors that allowed people to appreciate symmetry, or things that people find beautiful, things that make people contemplate and feel such strong, like you can just see an image and it evokes such strong emotions in you. So has that had an evolutionary sort of ring to it?
Well, I mean, okay, so how I think about it is all of us have that kind of an aesthetic
Right.
sense in us.
Yeah.
Whether
Appreciation for it.
you
Yeah.
might say that, okay, you know what, I don't like art. No, I don't like it. But you definitely will make a choice as to what color you're painting in your room. It's very
Yes.
cultural, I know.
Right.
You know, people might prefer pink. If you go to houses in South India, it's all pink and fluorescent. I find it very loud. It's
Yeah.
probably because of my training and culturally.
Right.
But they find that probably exciting and inviting. So what I'm saying is people do have that aesthetic sense, and you all gravitate towards sunset, sunrise, blue color. So if you look at color preference universally, people seem to prefer bluish color and avoid brown color. So there's some kind of ecological theory as to trying to explain why that is. But I think the question that you ask is bigger than why it is so, but how did it evolve? Or
Right. What factors could have helped this? I mean, get into our genes.
So I don't work on the theories of it.
Right.
So I think that the reason why we have this aesthetic sense is to drive us to certain behavior. Okay.
Okay.
So if you look at a courtship behavior, say the animal is supposed to be attracted to its opposite sex and it is going to mate, right? There has to be some kind of cue to say that this is what is the correct time for it to mate. All right, that could be called beauty, right? In many ways, beauty is a construct that we have, artificially put on
Right.
different things. Because as you know, even say beautiful person of the opposite sex, it's going to vary according to different cultures, right? Do you remember there was this Facebook artist who took a photograph of a girl and he or she gave it to different graphic design artists all over the world and asked them to say, make this person beautiful. They came up with completely different sort of manipulations to the facial features. So there is a huge amount of variability in what people perceive as beauty. Okay, so
That
given
stems
that,
from some sort of cultural bias, like you said.
well, the variability I think comes from nature, and also it is pushed around and pushed and pulled by culture. But the reason why I think we all have this concept of beauty is for evolutionary purposes. It's easy to explain in terms of, say, even a peacock, right? A peacock, the peahen is going to be attracted to a certain kind of a peacock which has this whole pattern. So it's basically a pattern recognition system. But it obviously is going to go to some full pattern that is able to detect, and not just a 3/4 of the. So the full one is the more beautiful than the one with the 3/4 of the feathers, right? So I would conceptualize it that way. So in terms of food also, people say that the primates develop trichromatic vision to differentiate between green and red, right? Because they need to figure out which is the right fruit to eat. So it could be that it evolved with a certain sort of purpose for survival, that we need to detect certain patterns that are required for survival, whether it's food and mating, things like that. But as we have more and more capacity for cultural beliefs and things like that, we sort of impose this idea of beauty on it.
Probably it has sunk down into our subconscious, and we do not realize where it comes from.
I mean, I'm also giving some theory. It might be true, it might not be true, but what I'm saying is that it's there. It's definitely there in every organism, mostly, that they do have certain stimuli that they gravitate towards. Okay, so it's a very sort of basic feature.
Right. And so when you sort of create art, whether it is for some conference or for some presentation, uh, how do you research about the specific topics? How do you bring the ideas together? Is there some process that you always
So
follow?
I have really stopped doing graphic design, mostly because it makes me think the same way I have to write a paper, or if I have to write an email. It makes me think too logically. So I it, that process is kind of boring. Okay. It's like, okay, you find out what they want, what is the message that has to be given, and what are the colors to use, what is the composition to use, what are the structures to use. So I kind of stopped doing that because it was really boring. So now I only do art, mostly abstract art, using woodcut prints, because initially I was doing digital collages. Um, um, so that process is, I really don't have any access to how that happens. It just happens that I'm thinking about something, and I think these messages actually relate to what I'm thinking about. Perhaps it's a very personal thing, others will not agree with me, but it so happens in my mind that there is a connection between the image that I'm creating and the idea in my head, and I put it out. And then I moved on to woodcut prints because it's more physically involved, so it's more satisfying. So I have to carve out the wood, and the ink is a very difficult medium, so you have to sort of think about
There
how
was some
to.
workshop, wood cutting workshop.
Yeah, there was a recent woodcut workshops, and the students enjoyed it a lot. In fact, somebody was messaging saying, why can't we have a workshop again, but Corona is happening. Hold on.
So I've started reading quite a lot of popular neuroscience right now. David
Good.
Eagleman,
Okay.
Oliver Sacks, and just started yet. So it has sort of affected how I think in some spiritual sense. It makes me realize how everything that we see is just a story that we've created for ourselves. So it makes me realize how we can only access a thin slice of reality and not the whole thing, and we probably overemphasize that and to make our own judgment. So it, in some sense, it has I feel how everything I feel, perceive, see in the world is because of some neurons buzzing here and there. So that is sort of liberating in some sense for me. Has neuroscience has that sort of an effect for you in some philosophical sense? Do you think about all?
I do, yeah. I mean, I need more when I'm doing the art than the neuroscience, because neuroscience it becomes sort of technical, and you really don't think about it when you're working in neuroscience. You know what I mean? Because you're going to be looking at some tiny question, and you're worried about the statistics and the p-value and the business side of it. Like you got to get this published and things like that. But later in the evening, perhaps you think about it. I think everybody thinks about where are we, who we are. Why do we do these things? Why am I getting so angry? Why am I doing these things?
Right.
And I don't think neuroscience gives you a clear answer to any of this. I think neuroscience is far away from giving any answers to it, but it does kind of affect your thinking. It's not just neuroscience. I think it's more scientists also, right? Once you have a very keen sense of analyzing situations and being very quote unquote rational, um, you sort of cut out certain things that are uh, you know impinging on your freedom and the way you really want to be. It's a personal thing for me that, okay, look, I mean, it's we're all made of the same things, and um, there is different cultures, and there is different kinds of reality for different people. And for me personally, it's not just neuroscience. um, there are many other influences. Literature and poetry probably influences me more than neuroscience.
Right. So everyone has their own view. So now I am a computer
Mhm.
science research intern.
Okay.
So I am starting to correlate the two
Mhm.
in my own sense. I know there is not. It's not. I mean, it's an upcoming field.
Mhm.
People are still trying to figure out. People have their own opinions. So, what is your sense? I wanted to know how optimistic you are about us being able to model a brain digitally. There's the Human Brain Project. They claim that by 2023 they'll be able to have a full working hardware software simulation
And
of the brain.
and what will that brain do? It will go to McDonald's and have a burger.
No, probably it'll just be like a static thing and more on the learning side. It won't be conscious, it won't be aware, I believe.
And
But
what will it learn?
I just
Yeah,
want to
I'm
know,
very
do you think
skeptical.
it sounds.
No, I mean, I'm very skeptical of this, big science, these ideologically driven big science that, hey, you know what, we're going to cure Alzheimer's, we're going to create the brain. And I think it's absurd to, you know, talk about an artificial brain. First of all, I don't understand the need to do that. Why would you need an artificial brain? We actually, I mean, people who in neuroscience are interested in behavior understanding person do understand what's happening, understand the
Right.
system. Of course, there is a large school who believes that you have to reverse engineer something to completely understand that.
Yeah.
But we can't. It's you really can't make these carbon based forms and the messy
The
biochemical
wetware, yeah.
stuff, uh, and clearly model it in some kind of in silico process. I'm not convinced of that.
Right. And what this sort of
Yeah, so
reductionist approach do you feel? I mean, it surely helps us sort of create these algorithms and automate some parts of the industry and things like that. So that way, it helps probably trying to break it down to the smallest neuron and trying to understand and trying to take insights from that and applying that to software systems that are
yeah,
there.
so if you so that's what it depends on what the goal is.
Right.
If you want to come into neuroscience and look at certain systems and say that, look, okay, this is going to be an inspiration for how my neural network is going to work, right? Then it's fine. But your goal is not to create an artificial brain or artificial intelligence, as they call it. So then it's fine, right? You can get inspiration from any discipline that you want, but to even call that your system is a brain is, I think, a little absurd.
Right. Do you think the vast complexity it's a little beyond our reach to sort of comprehend in some sense? Let's say it was important to understand the complexity and to sort of get some sense of how things work, but would it be in our sort of intellectual capabilities to get sense of that, make sense of that?
I mean, that's what neuroscientists are trying to do, right? Like, they're trying to understand how the system works. Okay, and it's a new field,
Right.
right? We've not been around for a long time, so maybe we'll understand how every little part and every little neuron, how it is connected and how it works, and maybe that will give us some answers as to how behavior is organized.
Elon Musk is working at Neuralink and he's trying to create brain computer interfaces. And I also read about how the brain is just, you can think of it as a general purpose computing device wherein it doesn't care where it gets the data from. It just learns to find patterns and make sense of that data for the individual. So, what is your sense of that? I mean, how far are we from being able to have these extensions of our bodies? And
I think the technology is already there. So even before Elon Musk did, there have been many groups in the world that have demonstrated that people can learn how to control a robotic arm using the control of their neuronal firing rates. Okay, it's not really the same thoughts. It's just that you're able to control your neuronal firing rate, and that you're getting a feedback for that, and then you are moving that particular actuator depending on how you're able to control your neuronal firing rate. Okay, that has been going on for a long time. So there have been groups in University of Washington, Germany, I forget where in Germany though, and Caltech. There were multiple groups. Even my PhD lab, we did this small project in which a robotic arm was moved by a monkey from the neuronal firing rate of the monkey in real time. It was just like a proof of concept idea. So
How
it's
robust is that? In like, I mean, would it work? I mean, in most cases, can that be applied to with prosthetics and things like that?
so they are
Yeah.
making a lot of advances in that field. So I think that for locked in patients and patients with spinal cord injury and things like that, it is going to be more useful. And especially now that EEG technology and the recording technology is getting more accessible, open sourced, and less expensive, there'll be more and more, uh, uh, you know, um, devices which will help people to move things and interface with another computer or a machine without the use of their hands and legs, with just their brain power.
Right. And like, what do you find? This might seem a little off, but off this train of thought, what do you find most satisfying about your work of the neuroscience related research or the art aspect of it? Not,
Both.
do-
Well, I can't think of not doing both.
okay.
Okay. So it's neuroscience part is what I'm enjoy during the day, and what I enjoy during the evening is making art and
Right.
other
Is there
things.
some goal that you're trying to achieve, like a personal goal in terms of your research, trying to some specific question that you want answered?
No, that way I'm not the most
Yeah.
ambitious guy you would find.
Right.
I I mean, because I don't want to say, okay, hey, you know what, I want to publish X amount of papers, or I want to do the
Right.
I just want to
Right.
figure out certain things. Those are my
Right.
research goals.
Right.
And maybe it's because of how I got into research. We all started that as a hobby. After classes, we went to the lab. Now I think about it, it sounds so geeky and kind of weird. We would go and spend 2-3 hours in the lab in my bachelor's, and now when I'm teaching, I realize that it's really really hard to motivate students to come and do anything if you don't give them credit or money.
Right.
So that's how it started. So I still try to stick to that kind of ethos. Even my PhD was good that way, in terms of I had a lot of freedom to do what I wanted to do. That's perhaps why I did not enjoy my postdoc, because it was all about productivity and very regimented, and this is what you have to do, and yeah. But the art also, I don't have any goals.
Right.
I do try and set some goals so that I do not just um, you know uh, be
I read
very
you find
lax
it as
about
a.
it. Was that?
I have read you that I read that you find it meditative in some sense. It I mean, that you get in a state of flow and things.
Yeah,
Makes you
the,
feel
the
good.
the the more time I spend on it, like, I realized that the amount of time me being frustrated is reducing, and me enjoying is sort of increasing, and it's not got to do with the outcome. I don't know what that is. It's
Because that
probably,
process helps you,
yeah, the
makes you feel
process
better.
helps. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, or else I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, before I close, I am in some sense interested in neuroscience, and apart from the work that I do related to computer science, how can people who are just trying to get some sense of the field, what sort of resources would you recommend? Books and yeah,
So I guess for you, you had already interned with Shanmuga,
yeah,
right? And you are planning to do a PhD in
masters or PhD,
masters
yeah,
or
in computer
PhD,
science, yeah,
right? And so I would say you have a. I mean, this applies to pretty much any field, not just neuroscience. Is you do an internship or you work for a year in a neuroscience lab. There are many in India,
right,
whichever topics that you find interesting, which is outside your comfort zone, and sort of the kind of work that you envision yourself doing, and just go and work with them for 6 months or a year, and I mean, people will pay you for it because you have a bachelor's degree, right?
right.
Um,
How important is it to come from a biology background?
it's not. It's not really. I mean,
Okay.
um, it's not at all needed. You can always learn some biology. I am actually an exception because, like I said, zoology became uncool after my after my stint, and everybody was biotech. People just started doing biotechnology. I mean, until now, I don't understand why people do a bachelor's in biotechnology. You're neither an engineer nor a biologist, and you do not know anything, right? So a lot of biotech people come into neuroscience, and all over the world, people from mathematics, computer science, literature, um, um, of course psychology, a lot of psychologists, and of course nowadays there are more and more undergraduate programs in neuroscience and cognitive science, so that gets pretty smooth. But I don't think you're at any disadvantage of uh, you know because of your computer science degree.
Right, and people who just want to like learn about the field, probably the popular science aspect to it, could you recommend some books, some authors, some of your favorite books? Probably?
Oliver Sacks is one of my favorites. Mostly because he has a little bit of a literary flourish, and it's not really boring to read every page, right? So he really writes beautifully about mental illnesses and how
The Man Who
appears
Mistook
in
His Wife is more anecdotal. What like are there other books that are not that anecdotal and probably give us
I
like a
think that
summary
is
of
the
field?
reason why I like him, is that he puts his personality into it.
Okay.
There are many books. Perhaps we can put that list in your
Yeah.
website or something, because I
I'll
just
put
can't.
yeah.
And I do keep reading, popular science books, just to
I'll
see
put
how
that list.
people have, conceptualized it and things like that. So there's a lot of information, but yeah, but it's an exciting time to learn about neuroscience, really.
Right. And any advice for people who are starting out with neuroscience, like just after school?
Just
Is
after
it
school,
an
okay.
undergraduate course, neuroscience?
Um,
Or
okay.
like what would be the right career path? Would doing zoology before
No,
would
I
it
mean,
be?
there is no right career path, and in one ways, it is lucky because neuroscience will accept pretty much anybody. Even our MSc Cognitive Science program here, majority of them are psychologists, but we take statisticians, we've taken political science student, we've taken literature, we've taken computer science, even a civil engineer. So it really does not matter what your sort of background is to get into a master's or a PhD program. So for an undergrad, I would just say that you try and have a as broad an education as possible. Okay, but I don't know how it's practical. I don't know if that is a
Okay.
practical advice.
Okay.
But
But just in some sense, which is connected to neuroscience, some field where you can probably not mechanical engineering or civil engineering that way, but
yeah,
some biology or psychology that somehow keeps you
yeah,
in
I
that.
think a bachelor's in psychology, philosophy, and mathematics would be ideal. But I don't know if you can find that combination.
Right.
But
But you can pick the subjects.
you can pick the
Pick the
subjects, right? You can do a bachelor's in psychology,
Hmm.
and yeah, and a lot of people who did bachelor's in engineering, like electronics, electrical, chemical, molecular biology, or the biochemistry of, and also, like, see, there are also biochemists who get into uh, neuroscience because they want to study the molecular biology or the biochemistry of mental illnesses or brain processes. So you can actually choose whichever path you want, or you can even do philosophy. So just do what you are interested in. Maybe read a wide variety of neuroscience books, popular books, and you see which is your aptitude towards it to make the best informed direction. And if you think you're more interested in the question of self and the philosophy of mind, then do a bachelor's in philosophy and then apply for a master's in.
I don't know many people who would be interested in the self and the free will and
Why
things
not?
like that in their undergrad. I mean, they're too young
No,
to
there are a lot
probably
of people who are doing BA in philosophy. How would you think they landed there? I
But
know you're
not
talking
many.
like
Yeah.
an engineer.
Yeah.
You assume that the
But
rest
yeah,
of the
our
world does
cultural
not.
backgrounds probably do not support a
But
BA in philosophy that much,
but
probably.
still, there are
Still, there are people doing
universities that are offering BA in
Right.
philosophies, and we also have students like that. We take in fact 3 years back there were 1, 2, 3, 4 students with a philosophy background in cognitive science. A couple of them went on to do a PhD as well. So that's what I mean. Don't really worry about if there's one advice, then I should give
Yeah.
that don't really worry about what is the right thing to do, what the society wants to do. Just do
Good.
what you really want to do. If you can't figure out, it's okay. People can't figure out. Just
Right.
do, just do something, and then you'll figure out later.
Right.
There's no reason to put yourself under so much stress and pressure, worrying about whether I made the right decision or will I make money, and that package and all that. It's I think it's really unwarranted. It sort of detracts from the pleasures of life. You can make this experience much more enriching if you can sort of go into this path of discover what you really want to do and then do it.
But probably that wisdom comes from age, and by realizing that,
I
okay,
know it
probably
is
I missed
unfair
those
for
years.
a 15-year-old to decide that, and it's
Right.
unfair for the society to put pressure on that person when they're doing that. All I'm
Right.
saying is that leave that pressure. You are going to make mistakes. It's going to be meandering, but you will at least have fun, is what I'm saying.
Right.
Right?
Alright. On that note, thank you so much.
All
Thanks
right.
a lot, sir.
Thank you. Bye bye.